The Thanksgiving Cattle Drive. To most people, Thanksgiving conjures up memories of Grandma's house and the smell of turkey roasted in the oven. To me and my 9 brothers and sisters, it's Iowa and the annual Thanksgiving Cattle Drive. My mother saw Thanksgiving as a chance to get work done. "You can eat any day," she'd say. "I don't want you parking your feet underneath my table. Thursday we move cows home for the winter." My mother was sneaky like that. She cooked for 12 people every day of the week. On Thanksgiving, she wanted the day off. Moving the cows entailed rounding up about 100 head of Angus cows and steers and driving them from the pasture 4 miles east of town to a farm about 3 miles west of town. There the cattle spent the winter in a feedlot with a barn. My brother John told me they trucked the cows back to the pasture in the spring. I'm skeptical. Don't ask me why we herded the cows in the fall and trucked them back in the spring. I don't know. I'm guessing that there were only a few that went back to the pasture in the spring. The rest were trucked somewhere else. Even though it's best not to examine some things too closely. Besides, my job was to herd, keep my head low, and not ask too many questions. As a grade school kid in Grettinger, Iowa, I remember the days leading up to Thanksgiving vacation. We'd color turkeys over our handprints, make little Indian headdresses. All the while, my friends were jabbering on about what they were going to have for their big Thanksgiving Day feast, how much they planned to stuff in their bellies, and what football teams they were going to root for. Me, I'd contemplate the Grettinger Thanksgiving Cattle Drive and how many clothes I was going to have to layer on to stay warm during the impending ordeal. At 5:30 a.m. Thanksgiving morning, my brothers and sisters and I would get up and do farm chores as we did every other day of the week. Milk the cows, feed and water the pigs, eat a big breakfast. Then at about 7 a.m., we would stuff ourselves into the warmest work clothes we could find. It didn't even matter if they were your clothes. If you could find long johns, hooded sweatshirts, couple of jackets, mittens, boots, whatever was laying around. Fashion was not a consideration. Then we'd rev up every motorized vehicle we owned and headed east. Our entourage usually consisted of 2 or 3 Chevrolets, a couple of pickups, maybe a moped or 2. The exact mix largely depended on how many of us had driver's licenses, or at least had maybe driven a tractor once or twice. One year, my sister Judy rode her horse Duchess. Judy had always fantasized that this was a cowboy roundup and she was Roy Rogers. The whole thing was a disaster. My dad put his foot down, and the next year, Judy was back to driving a car. We got to the pasture around 7:30 in the morning. Then all hell broke loose. Each year seemed as though it was our first. My dad, sometimes my Grandpa Grettinger, maybe my Uncle Hap, would hop out of their vehicles and start running around through the field yelling, "Hya! Hya!" Kids joined in too. They would yell and flap their arms. Slowly the cows would rise to their feet, ease themselves toward the gate. Then something would happen, and the cows would run to the other side of the pasture, and then the mayhem would start again. The reason I say they rather than we is because I never remember going to the field. I chose to sit in the car parked on the road with my mom. We were up high, and we watched and laughed at all the commotion. It was like the closest thing I ever came to watching sports on Thanksgiving. My dad would always be the commander. He'd bark orders to the kids like, "Get out of the way," or "Damned kids," or "What do you think you're doing?" Then the pickups would fly wildly around the field with teenagers behind the wheel. Like I said, in the field, you really didn't need a driver's license. Just as long as your leg was long enough to reach the accelerator and you had a good arm to steer. The mopeds screamed and squealed as they skipped across the pasture. Kids ran helter-skelter uncontrollably. The cows were either totally baffled or scared to death. I think they just tried to flee. Whatever it was chaos. Mainly my dad cussed. When Grandpa was there, he cussed too. Uncle Hap cussed. My mom and I sat perched on the road in the warm car, and we laughed. On a good day, it took about half an hour to get the cows rounded up and heading toward the road. On a bad day, maybe an hour and a half. But as soon as the lead cow's hoof hit the gravel road, we knew we were on our way. From then on, it was like clockwork, almost. A car or pickup drove ahead of the herd and dropped off a kid or two at the end of each farm lane. Then the kids stood, watching their breath turn white in the frosty air, rubbing their noses and hands to stay warm, kicking a few rocks. As the cows reached each lane, the kid manning the post screamed like hell and hopped around like a lunatic. "Hya! Hya!" Even a cow knows enough to stay away from a crazy kid. As soon as the cows passed, the kid would walk behind for a while yelling, "Hya! Hya!" then jump in the car following the herd. When a few kids were on board, the car honked its horn like crazy and moved through the mass of black bovine bodies to become the car at the front. Then, one by one, it dropped off its young passengers at new strategic locations. Then it stopped, letting the cows pass again until it became the car at the rear. As the eighth child out of 10, I was always at a disadvantage. During the what I call cattle drive years, I never had my driver's license, so I never got to be a driver. And I don't think they ever trusted me on a moped. So instead, I always ran, jumped, and flapped around like a loon. I was a foot soldier, young and naive. I went with the flow. Wherever someone told me to go, I went. By the time I was 10, I was getting a little smarter. I developed a strategy. I volunteered to stand sentry at one of the first important posts, the turn onto the main highway. It was about a half a mile down the road from the cow pasture and right in front of Agnes's house, a friend of my parents'. As long as I took this watch, I never went to the field. Instead, I observed the pasture pandemonium from my nice warm window seat in Agnes's kitchen, where she fed me fresh baked pie and cookies and 7-Up. Never mind, it was only 7:30 in the morning. Yeah, as far as I was concerned, Agnes's kitchen was the place to be. I didn't even join the rest of the clan until about a mile into the drive. So I'd sit there after about a half an hour or so of drinking 7-Up and giving Agnes a lowdown on the latest elementary school gossip. I'd spy the dust cloud moving down the gravel road. That was my cue to gulp out a couple of quick thank yous and run like hell to my post. As I said before, the highway turn was a key position, but I hit it down pat. A crazy look, a couple of authoritative yahs, and the cows turned onto the main highway without a glitch. Mom picked me up in her nice warm Chevrolet. I was back in the action. By this time, at least one calf was straggling behind the herd. The poor little bugger was probably only a few weeks old. One of my brothers would scoop it up and toss it in the back of the pickup. It would ride easy the rest of the way. Unfortunately, its mother never liked being separated from her baby. She mooed, the baby cried back. Slowly, the pickup moved through the herd to the front. All the mother could do was follow the pickup and its precious little cargo. After leaving Agnes's house, the next stop for me was the river bridge, which we'd hit about 10:30 or 11 on Thanksgiving morning, just in time to halt all of the other families on their way to more traditional holiday get-togethers. Iowa farmers like to have their holiday dinners at the same time they eat dinner every other day, high noon. The river bridge was a truss bridge with metal girders on the top and sides. Cows hate to cross bridges, especially ones that make them feel enclosed. This was probably the toughest maneuver of the cattle drive, and we knew it. We were ready, though, all hands on deck. The trick was to get the lead cow to make that first step onto the bridge platform, and once that happened, the others would follow. The unfortunate truth was, we didn't always know which cow was the lead cow. We'd watch the herd's behavior for miles and try to determine which cow they were following. Sometimes it was easy, most of the time it wasn't. That's when the river bridge turned into a free-for-all. We dreaded the river bridge. Now when I think about it, I remember Thanksgiving traffic at a dead stop. Horns blaring, trying to cross the bridge, the cows getting jumpy, adults and kids alike lined on either side of the road, creating a funnel onto the bridge. The wild look in the poor animals' eyes as they approached that platform, their big heads shaking in anger and disgust, saliva flying, breath billowing, loud moos in the cold fall air. Nerves. Cows and kids standing eye to eye, neither ready to back down. Suddenly a cow bolts, breaking the human fence. "Get that cow! We're losing them!" Dad yells. A teeming mass of beefy black bodies follow, flooding down the steep embankment towards the river and swarming at the river's edge, moving every which way. My brothers, sisters, Uncle Hap, Mom, running after the cows, trying to ebb the bovine flow. Me running through the tall brown cattails and foxtails as high as my head, waving my arms frantically, screaming, "Hya! Hya!" Cars and pickups parked everywhere. Thanksgiving revelers piling up on the highway. Men I may or may not recognize in their best Sunday suits, jumping out of their cars to help. Bless their souls. One or two terrified cows falling in the river. Dad cussing. Grandpa cussing. Uncle Hap cussing. Let's just say, as I recall, this was not a well-synchronized maneuver. Most likely, crossing the river bridge took about half an hour. It may just have seemed longer in my child's mind. I also recall that when the first cow crossed the bridge, we all breathed a sigh of relief. The men slapped each other on the back and shook hands with those who stopped to help. We'd laugh and say, "Well, that wasn't as bad as last year," and then we'd move back into our team drill. Drop off, jump like a raving lunatic, pick up, until we hit Main Street, Grettinger, Iowa. Every July, Pamplona, Spain has the running of the bulls. Every Thanksgiving Day about noon, Grettinger, Iowa had the running of the cows. Once we turned down Main Street, we had to contend with open yards and driveways. Thankfully, by then, the cows were pretty much worn down. The river bridge took away most of their fight. Once in a while, one would break rank and run over Bradley's yard or the yard of some other unfortunate town family who happened to live along the route, but not so often. However, for me, at this point, the cows were not my biggest concern. I was more worried about keeping my head down and avoiding the eyes of my classmates. I was certain the cattle drive wouldn't enhance my image at school. With all the clothes I had on, I looked like a reject from a Ma and Pa Kettle movie. Even so, I could bet somebody would get a photograph of my family driving cows down Main Street because it always found its way under the front page of the Grettinger Times. Let's face it, our Thanksgiving cattle drive was big news in Grettinger, Iowa. Thankfully, we only had a short way to go on Main Street before we turned left and headed down a side street and out of town, eating dust along another gravel road. From then on, the cattle drive was a cakewalk. The cows were tired after walking 5 miles, and they only had 2 more miles to go. That was about the time Mom, a couple of my sisters, and I split for home. That's when we cooked Thanksgiving dinner. "Hamburger or hot dog," I'd yell, as one by one each family member stumbled through the door. My sisters and I took turns at the frying pan, slicing hot dogs in half and pushing them down hard with a spatula until they sizzled against the cast iron skillet. "There you go," I'd say as I passed somebody their order on a thin white paper plate. Bags of sunbeam bread, Highland potato chips, and Oreos all lay open on the table along with ketchup and mustard. "Help yourself," I'd say. Yep, that was a traditional Grettinger Thanksgiving. I'll never forget it. Now, every year in early November, I receive a phone call from my sister Rose. "Come for Thanksgiving dinner," she'll say. "A traditional Grettinger Thanksgiving?" "You bet. We're making hot dogs. I may even throw in a frozen pizza." To which I reply, "I'll bring the Oreos."